It's wonderful to be here in Brunswick Library to talk to you about my book, Laurinda. So I'll mainly focus on Laurinda tonight. I've all mic'd up because this is being filmed for the library. But what Laurinda starts off with is a quote by Kurt Vonnegut, which a lot of high school students would have studied his books. And Kurt Vonnegut said that all life is high school, and it comes from a much larger paragraph where he talked about high school. And this is really interesting because I was watching the news today and reading the newspapers. Kurt Vonnegut said that true terror is to wake up one morning and discover that your high school class is running the country. Now that sounds kind of funny until we look at modern day politics in Australia and you think, yeah, you know, that there is a high school class that is running this country, and we've woken up and it's actually become a little bit of a reality for us. And when I read newspapers or switch on the news or watch TV, shows like Q&A, it seems like these days we're more interested in what people think than what they know or what they can do. You only have to look at the recent knee-jerk coverage of things said by our Prime Minister or human rights reports that are left unread while the country focuses on which powerful person wants to get rid of another powerful person's position. So what I wanted to explore in this book, Laurinda, is where does all this begin? So this is what Laurinda explores, and tonight I'd like to talk to you about four main themes of the book. This idea of the natural born leader is the first theme, this idea of femininity and self-esteem. We just had International Women's Day about a week ago. The idea that some schools cultivate that when you're doing good, it must feel good. And finally, and probably most importantly, the idea of class, which isn't all that discussed in Australian politics or literature these days. So Laurinda is inspired a lot by my own experiences of high school. Now, I went to 5 different high schools and I visit about 100 high schools per year, but as a student I went to 5, so that's 1 every year almost. And I went through the whole system, the Catholic system, the private system, the selective school system, the single-sex system, and also the, the co-educational high school system. I also grew up in a neighbourhood called Braybrook. Now, some of you might have heard of Braybrook. It's in the western suburbs. And I grew up there in the 1980s and 90s. And there were 2 types of people in Braybrook. You see them on television. They were the bogans. The working class Australians, or the Australians, the old families of Braybrook, as my friend Les Twentyman calls them, who've been there for a long time. And then there were the new Australians like us. And we weren't bogans, we were aspiring bogans. We're like the Bogasians, the Bogan Asians. And so this idea of, being more interested in what people think than what they know, what they can do, wasn't something I learnt growing up in Braybrook, because I grew up in a community where kids did everything. So from the age of 8 or 9 onwards, I was translating letters for my mother who couldn't read English. And it's wonderful to see so many multicultural faces. You probably did the same thing, called up the telephone company and politely explained or asked why you've been overcharged while your Chinese mum is in the background yelling and saying, they charged us too much. To sewing clothes at home if you had families that worked as outworkers, to working in the family business. In the 1980s and 90s, when you went to Footscray to have fur or to do whatever you did shopping, you would see these, there was this one schoolboy who would have been 13 years old. He was in his private school tie, he had it loosened, and he would be serving customers at his family restaurant. Or even with 3 young girls I know who I've befriended, who are in high school, they translate oncology reports for their parents. So these were kids that were really practical, that could do day-to-day things. And Laurinda is set in a private all-girls school. Now, a lot of people have gone online or have asked me, Did you base it on any particular school? Come on, you based it on Lauriston College, didn't you? It sounds like Lauriston, or it sounds like MLC. But I didn't set out to malign any particular private school. Back many years ago, back in the 1980s, a Canadian author called Robert Khmer wrote a really groundbreaking young adult book called The Chocolate War, which explored the power of, the power of evil that could permeate a society. So Laurinda is not based on any school I've been to or any school I know. It's based on a particular culture. And one of the most dangerous things you could find these days is this idea of the career politician. So Laurinda is a fictional high school that's ruled by what's called a cabinet, which is a trio of 3 girls who are at the top, the apex of the high school. Now they're called the cabinet because back in the 1800s, when the school was a finishing school for young girls, girls were meant to be cultivated at this school, finished, and then they were said to be in the cabinet for eligible young bachelors from the neighbouring boys' school to pick out and to marry, and those who didn't get picked out were considered in the cabinet. So it's evolved, and women's liberation hit the school back in the 60s, and so the girls are very aspirational, but there's still this unspoken hierarchy called the cabinet of 3 very powerful girls. Now there's a American writer called John Le Carre, who said, "A desktop is a dangerous place from which to view the world." And when I moved from my western suburbs school to a school that was my first private school that I went to, it was a huge cultural shift for me. I was one of the few Asian kids in the class, and back then in 1996, before she went on Dancing with the Stars, a politician came into power, Pauline Hanson, and she said, "Oh, there's too many Asians in this country, they form ghettos and they don't assimilate." Now, the girls with which I was at this school, they were so benign, and they were so, they were so interested in me. But what was so interesting about that time was, this idea of belonging was a strange idea for me. So I was treated a little bit like a permanent exchange student. People were interested in me because of my culture and my Chinese Cambodian background. And so I was like a permanent exchange student. And so what happened was, I remember one of the more accomplished girls in the class who did debating, who was in choir, who learnt Latin, who was part of all these leadership organisations. She had this quote on her diary, and the quote was, "Have you come here to join us?" And underneath it says, "No, I've come here to lead you." So that was her guiding motto in life, and her dream was to become a third world feminist. And I didn't know anything about feminism or the third world, but I think I was the closest she'd got to the third world, so she was kind of interested in me. And when I first started speaking to schools 9 years ago, when Unpolished Gem first came out, which is my first book, I remember being invited to give the keynote address at a dinner of an all-girls private school. It was a very generous school, and I told the students that well-intentioned people, the people who loved them the most, their teachers, parents, careers advisors, would always be encouraging them to be successful, because that is the leadership model of such schools. So I decided to tell them a different story. I decided to tell them a little bit about some failures that I'd suffered in life, and not only myself, my mother, who has been here, for about 35 years. She doesn't speak English very well, and she's never learnt English all that well as well. And that's because she spent most of, the first 20 years of her life in Australia raising 4 kids and working in the garage as an outworker. And when she was about 40, which is when I was going through year 12, which is when this group of year 12 girls in this private school is going through year 12, my mother came out of the garage, and she was a jewellery maker, so it was a very difficult job. She had 3rd-degree burns up her arm, and her eyesight was going all funny because she was in the dark most of the time, and she had this cough that wouldn't go away because she was working with dangerous chemicals like potassium cyanide. And she said, "I quit this. I'm going to get myself a factory job. I'm going to work at your dad's shop." And I said, great, Mum. So she took adult migrant English classes, and she would come home with these worksheets, fill in the gaps about Ned Kelly, or she'd sit with my sister and her school reader, and we'd go through each word of these very simple books. Pat is a cat. He is a black and white cat. And my mother would read the book not once, not twice, but 3 times without making a single mistake. And I was pretty pleased. I said, Mum, you're a really fast learner. And my mother has a bad temper. So one day she just picked up the book, she flung it across the room and said, don't say such crap, it's useless, I can't learn anything. And I was pretty shocked, and my sister Alina, who was in grade prep, they were her books, she sat there looking quite bewildered as well. And I was kind of really pissed off at my mum. I said, why did you do this? You know, we're trying to teach you and you're doing all right and you've just given up. I didn't understand that my mother, her first language, she doesn't have much of an education. So she finished school at grade 2 because in Cambodia, that was when they started closing down the Chinese schools. So she has a grade 2 education in her first language, and she had no English grounding. And she picked up the book and she turned it to the middle page and she pointed to a word and she said, this word, I don't know what it says. And I said, of course you do. You read the book to me 3 times without making a mistake. And she said, oh, look, I memorized it when you first read it to me. I can't read. I don't know what all these squiggles mean. And I realized she couldn't read. She didn't understand phonetics and she couldn't understand how the letters fitted together. And she sighed and she said, it's no use, you know, you've got to study hard now, you've got to be successful because you're our only hope out of here. And Braybrook was a very factory-based suburb, you know, and the fumes were, you know, permeated every single house. And you grew up with people who were living through not first-generation welfare, not second, but third-generation welfare. Some of the families, because back in 1983, the recession hit Braybrook very hard, and a lot of the factories got closed down that had been operating for hundreds of, you know, about 100 years, including the very famous Harvester factory in Sunshine. And so my mother's failure to learn English set her into a deep spiral. She got really depressed, actually, except when you're a migrant woman, you don't believe in depression. You believe there's a line, and on one end there's sanity, and on the other hand there's insanity, there's craziness. And so my mother always believed she was sane, but she was just having a heart attack. Because when you have anxiety, severe anxiety, it is like having a heart attack. So she'd go to her doctors and she'd say, oh, doctor, my heart's jumping out of my chest. I'm going to die and leave behind 4 kids. What am I going to do? And the doctors would say, oh, you know, you've got anxiety. And she said, I'm not crazy, just give me some pills for my heart attack. So she was put on antidepressants, which she believed were pills for her heart attack because she couldn't read, of course, but they really zonked her out, you know. So when I went through year 12, I was looking after my younger brothers and sisters, there's 4 of us, and it was a bit of a tough year. And I had equally kind teachers who really believed in me and said, Alice, you're really going to be successful, you know, you'll get scholarships to the university. My dad told me the same thing, my grandmother who loved me, they all really drilled in this idea of success for me. But the problem is, you grow up in Braybrook and you don't really have an idea of what success looks like. I mean, you see your teachers and they're educated, and you see your family doctor. They're the only 2 groups of professionals you see, because you don't know any accountants or lawyers or engineers, or those other countless professions that you meet when you get to university. And so I had no idea what success looked like, so all the words just went over my head. But I kind of had a very clear-cut idea of what failure looked like, which is all these poor migrant women who had considered themselves having made it, worked 2 decades of their lives, got out of Braybrook, moved to Caroline Springs or St Albans or Avondale Heights, built these enormous houses that look like Chinese wedding cakes, you know, big white ones of columns, and their kids would be at school, as we were, and they'd turn on the television and they couldn't enjoy their new lives of luxury because, firstly, my mother couldn't go back into the garage to work. Secondly, she couldn't enjoy television because she had no idea what was going on. She couldn't understand what people were saying. And so it was very isolated. And so I had a bit of a breakdown in year 12, just thinking about failure a lot incessantly. It was like your mind is like a computer and you run too many programs on your computer and it just, goes into overdrive and gets a virus and it doesn't function so well. And we treat our computers better sometimes than we treat young people who have a bit of a rough time, because we say, what do you have to complain about? You're in a private school, you've got all your meals, you're healthy, this is not Pol Pot's Cambodia. But with computers, you don't hide it away and put a white cloth over it. You don't smash your computer because it's an expensive piece of hardware. If your computer breaks down, you just install Norton antivirus and reboot it. If it's an old system, takes a bit longer, but eventually it gets there. But the saddest thing I've noticed from my 10 years of visiting schools is that's generally not how we treat young people. We expect things to move very fast for them. We expect them to be stoic and resilient without teaching them about failure. So anyhow, I talked to these girls in this school and the girls got it. They understood. But at the end there were some questions and the teacher stood up. And I think she was a little bit annoyed at me, and she said, look, Alice, are you telling our girls, are you encouraging our girls to fail? And that was a really silly question, because I said that, failure doesn't need encouragement from me, and anyone could fail. It happens to everyone. And so when I started to write my second book, which is about my father taught me great lessons about failure. Unfortunately, they weren't the lessons he taught me in year 12, which is why I spiraled down. He was a survivor of the killing fields, and only when I was in my 20s did he tell me how he survived and his wonderful stories of resilience. But he didn't want to tell us when we were younger because he didn't think we'd be able to handle it. And so from my dad's life, I learned that sometimes life will take everything away from you, and you'll probably be ruled by 14-year-olds with AK-47s and machetes who'll kill you if you show any sign of intelligence or education. And sometimes you'll be so hungry that you'll eat everything, scorpions, spiders, cane toads, even your own belt, as my dad did. So he was a man when he went to the killing fields. And under Pol Pot's Cambodia, you were ruled by, 14-year-old boys with guns. If you were educated, all that had no significance at all. So I grew up with these parents who taught me humility, and they also taught me this one thing that isn't really advocated in schools. They taught me that being a follower is not necessarily a bad thing, because sometimes you need to be a follower just to survive. You need to keep quiet about what you know, otherwise you'll be executed. Or even to learn anything. You can't lead straight away. You've got to have a mentor. And when you have a mentor, you follow them. That's exactly what you do. Leadership is a learned skill. It's not innate. And yet what I notice time and time again with schools that really keep promoting this idea of leadership and success is that they keep promoting the kids who already have a voice, who develop early language skills, who have books in the house, who are good debaters, who are good orchestrators, who are best at ingratiating themselves to adults. Now, we didn't grow up with many books in the house. We had the Reader's Digest book of household hints and handy tips, which my dad bought me because I was doing a lot of the work around the house, and I didn't understand much about sexism. I loved that book, So it had very handy tips about removing stains from clothes and things like that. And the other book was a book about poisonous snakes. Now, my mother's literature was really interesting. It came twice a week. She'd go to the letterbox and she'd open it up, and she'd take the Safeway and Bilo ads and she'd look at the numbers, because of course she's literate in numbers, and she'd look at tomatoes on sale and things like that. So that was the literature around our house. And so this idea, that leadership is natural, innate to some people, I just don't believe is true. So this brings me to the second theme. When I started writing Laurinda, I noticed an interesting thing in some schools, which is this idea of femininity, this idea that you really have to cultivate a girl's self-esteem, which I believe in. But I had one school who were great. They were studying the killing fields for their year 9 and 10 students, And when my book, Her Father's Daughter, came out, which is about my dad surviving the killing fields, they invited me to speak to their class. And I was really happy about that, except a teacher pulled me aside because she'd seen me at a library session, and she said, well, you're going to be talking to some of our girls, but could you please not show some of the slides that you show in the library? And I said, oh, okay, what slides do you mean? And she said, just don't show the students some pictures of the killing fields. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. These are 14 and 15-year-old girls. They read and watch The Hunger Games, which is a fictional book about kids who kill each other for fun. And this is history, you know. I don't put slides up to rub it in people's faces that there are skulls and crossbones. But the message I was getting from this very well-intentioned school was that you have to teach the students about how lucky they are, you know, but please leave out the gory bits. And I looked at the class of 200 students in year 9 and 10. There was one student that stuck out, firstly because she was black, so she was like an African girl. I see a lot of African girls in Footscray. The only black face in 200 or so faces. And I thought, you must, you know, you probably came from Sudan, you probably want a scholarship to this school, and if the girls next to you aren't allowed to understand the background from which you came, how do you exist in a school like that, you know? So this is why I created the character of Lucy. She is every refugee and migrant child who has ever sat in a class where people might have seen her as a teaching tool or the quiet achiever scholarship girl, where the only thing quite interesting about her is what kind of lesson she can impart to her fellow classmates about just how lucky they are, and beyond that, they don't want to hear about the horrors. So then it led me to think about this idea that doing good must feel good, which is a very terrible idea, because at one school I visited, I think I was the 100th speaker for the year, so it was a very, very wealthy school, and it was for Social Justice Week, and I could have said anything to these girls, anything, the most shocking thing at all, and they would have sat there passively, and they had quite bored faces, but they were very polite and very well behaved. But you can tell when students are bored, and it was because, not because of who I was, but just because I was the 100th speaker, so speakers came all the time. And then after I finished, I only had 10 minutes, and I was paid quite handsomely for 10 minutes, so I was pretty pleased. I sat on stage, and two girls walked on stage, and the girls started to perk up, and I thought, this is interesting. Something interesting is happening. And the two girls who were the prefects talked about raising money for the Red Cross. They were going to have a fashion parade, and the makeup artist was a man called Napoleon, who has makeup stores everywhere. And Alana Hill was going to donate a lot of her clothes, and all mothers were encouraged to come along. And you know, almost as if they had to come along. It was a school excursion. And I realised, wow, you know, when we raised money for the Red Cross, we just went and knocked on doors in Braybrook with a tin. This is a full-on fashion show. And I thought, well, how would you have a scholarship student being able to do good for their school or participate in such fundraisers, if that's the idea of doing good? Because how do you feel generous when generosity is so tied to having lots of time, firstly, and secondly, lots of money, because a ticket to the fashion show would be like $65, and then you'd buy some makeup and other things like that. And so this was quite different from the kids with whom I work in Braybrook and Footscray, with Les Twentyman, the legendary social worker, where his leadership program is to pick the most disadvantaged kids, but not the ones who have leadership potential, the ones who don't have leadership potential, the ones that are so beaten down that they're self-harming, they're so low in self-esteem that they don't turn up to school, and to cultivate them. And because he says these are the most resilient kids, you know, if they've survived like this. And Richard, who is the longest serving social worker in Australia, he's been serving for 40 years, he works with Les, has a program called Back to School, where, you know, we deliver books to kids who don't have books, and that could mean the difference between them going to school or just staying at home, or just, you know, getting up to no good in alleyways and things like that. And Richard told me that one of the first kids he delivered books to, he couldn't find his address. And he drove around the streets of Sunshine thinking, where does this kid live? And someone said, oh, you're looking for whatever his name was, Rory or Matt, he's over there. And he realised the kid was living in the back of a car boot. Like he'd sleep in the car boot because it was warm, and then during the day he'd get up and just go to school. And Richard thought, well, if these kids really, are that desperate to go to school, then the least we could do is just to give them books. And sometimes it doesn't feel good when you do good. It didn't feel good when I was growing up and, my mother was going through her depressive episodes. You're trying to teach her English and she just throws the books away. But you persevere with these things. So the final theme of Laurinda I'd like to talk to you about before some questions, which I have a little slideshow of, is this idea of class. Because I was reading The Guardian today. There was an article on Knox Grammar School. I don't want to malign any schools, but this just happened to be in the news. And the author of this article said there was a certain texture to life at Knox that made the school what it was. The immediacy of history and tradition, the presence of old boys and the senior staff on the sports field, in the cadet unit, at the pub, the donnish attitudes of some teachers. It was the insular sense of privilege, the ebb and flow of generations of students marked by destiny, the school's desire to produce and own its students' achievements. Those values also created an environment where child abusers could thrive. This was an ex-student of Knox, and the former principal of Knox during that time, he said some very insightful words, but unfortunately he never followed through on them. He said, the serial killer, the children high on drugs, the clergyman who kills an abortionist, each can have high self-esteem and feel very good about themselves while they commit their abominations. So this idea that, you have to cultivate a young lady to have high self-esteem, because girls have weaker self-esteem. You can't show them pictures of the killing fields. You must teach them to do good, but only if it feels good, is an idea of a culture that fosters bullying. So this is a picture of, just a standard picture of a private school. It's not an Australian one because I didn't want to malign any, but you see it's quite similar, there's a beautiful environment like that. And this is how private schools are represented in popular culture. So you've got Khmer and things like that. But what's so funny is, so this is Chris Lilly's show, Khmer Private School Girl, is when this book came out, firstly it was marketed as young adult, and secondly, people really wanted to focus on the bullying aspect of it and the idea of wealthy private school girls, when I found the most interesting facet of writing Laurinda was the huge class difference between having to work in a back shed like Lucy does and then going to school with girls who are a lot more learned than she is. They've read Shakespeare, they know Australian politics, they know, all sorts of things that she doesn't know, and yet they don't have practical life skills, so they wouldn't be able to go home on a bus or catch a bus through 4 different suburbs to get back to Braybrook or wherever they come from. And so that was the juxtaposition that I wanted to explore. Also, the final thing I'm going to show you, this is a school, it's an Australian school. I looked up their uniform. So this is where class factors into this idea of education. This is a school's compulsory sports uniform, a girls' school. So you've got 14 separate items that are completely compulsory. You notice every single item, even the socks and things like that, have to have the school logo on it. So you couldn't go to Kmart and buy cheap $3 socks. You've got to get your $12 socks at the school. But not only that, there's a second page where there's the optional sports uniform. If you really want to make it as a sporting star, you've got to buy all these different things to do the extracurricular sports in addition to the sports that you do at school. So the final quote, or the final thing I'd like to say is, there's a scene in Laurinda where, Lucy gets sent these letters home from school saying she's not participating in enough extracurricular activities because she's at home, doing stuff for her mum. And her mum says, why have you chucked these school letters in the bin? Her mum can't read them. And Lucy says, oh, they're nothing. And her mum said, but they're printed on such good paper. You can't just chuck school letters. Are you in trouble? And she said, no. And the mum says, well, what's this about? And Lucy says, oh, they just want me to play sports. And the mum said, oh yeah, just go and play sports at school. Bring your little brother with you, he can play as well. You know? And this family has no idea how seriously the school Laurinda takes their sports. So thank you so much. You've been a wonderful group to speak to tonight, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have afterwards. An excellent question. Did I intend Laurinda not to be a young adult novel? Well, yeah, when I first started writing it, there have been a number of writers who write about the teenage experience without necessarily writing from as a teenager. So Margaret Atwood is one, and there's a writer in America called Curtis Sittenfeld who wrote a book called Prep. And so I started writing this book about, the differences between class and how difficult it is in Australia for someone to switch class, even though we assume we're all egalitarian. And then Lucy's voice just came to me. So it was a 15-year-old's voice, and some people have said, that's not a 15-year-old's voice, she thinks her thoughts are really sophisticated, but 15-year-olds are reading Shakespeare, they're reading Jane Austen's Emma, they're writing essays about things. Of course their thoughts are sophisticated, they just don't talk to their friends in that way. So, so Lucy is a 15-year-old voice, and then because it was set in a private school, the publisher, Black Ink, my publishers, who are very good at publicity, thought, this will be great. Schools will really get onto this if we market it as a young adult novel. And it's been wonderful because schools have been very interested in this. But the group of people that I'm most touched by are teachers who've read this book. And just yesterday, in fact, I was at Salesian College in Sunbury, and a teacher came up to me because there are vulnerable teachers in this book. And students can bully teachers just as badly, if not worse, than they can bully other students, because if you bully a student, they have recourse. Their parents could come up and, the school could get in trouble. If you bully a teacher, often, if it's not a supportive environment, the teacher would get told off for not being able to control the class. So this teacher said, when I read your book, it was therapeutic because this group of students had given her a very hard time. Not at Salesian College, at one of her earliest schools when she first started out. Yeah, so the reason I think Laurinda's done so well, it's gone into reprint, is just because it crosses over, I think, young adult and adult. This lady's father was a Holocaust survivor, and her father's daughter was a book that took me 10 years to write. It just took me so long. Because I didn't want to write a story about genocide. I didn't survive a genocide. In the end, I started writing a story about a father-daughter relationship. When you grow up as a child of a genocide survivor, you get an interesting outlook on life. So my father doesn't believe in post-traumatic stress, just like my mother doesn't believe in mental illness. He believes you can start from scratch, which is why he named me Alice. Because when he arrived in Australia, he thought this country was a wonderland. So that's how I got my very optimistic name. But when I was growing up, he did crazy things. My sister had a blood nose once. She was about 11, and he called an ambulance, and all the neighbours came out thinking there was a terrible emergency or something had happened, and it was just a little girl with a blood nose. And when the ambulance went away, my mother yelled at him. She was so livid. She said, what do you think you're doing? Firstly, you've wasted the ambulance's time when some old person could have a heart attack, and now, And she says, secondly, we have to pay high insurance premiums. What are you doing? And he didn't say anything, but I think that under Pol Pot's Cambodia, if a child started bleeding, it meant that they would die. There were no antibiotics, you could get infections. And the other thing was he wanted us to be strong and resilient, so he put us all into self-defense classes. My two sisters dropped it. Me and my sister Alison dropped it because we're no good at it. But my younger sister continued for years until she got a black belt. And we were so proud when she did her grading, because you have to do a number of tests. And so she went on her final test, she had a block of wood, and she went smack with her fist, and she broke it in two. And we all clapped and cheered, and I thought my dad would be the happiest person in the room, but he went all pale and he was all shaky, and he was shaking his head. It was like he saw something terrible. And we thought, what's up with Dad? He sent her to self-defense lessons. She's become a black belt in Taekwondo. And then I realized that he was remembering the Khmer Rouge soldiers who were just children, who had the power of life and death over adults. And he didn't want my sister, he didn't realize, you know, that my sister had such aggression in her. He didn't, suddenly all distinctions between self-defense and aggression disappeared. So those were the things that kind of pop up when you're a child of Holocaust survivors, as you probably understand. Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. So what led me to go to 5 different schools? Well, I guess my father was a main part of it. My father was one of those very aspirational dads who really wanted me to do better in the world than he had. He lost 4 years of his life under Pol Pot, and he really believed in education. So when I started off at Footscray Girls Secondary College, which was a remarkable school, at that time 75% of the girls were from migrant backgrounds, and many of them had just been to the English Learning Centre for 3 months before they were put in year 7, year 8, year 9, year 10, you know. So that was very difficult for them. And you had this great hodgepodge of cultures and very, very strained teachers who worked really hard, but it was a rough culture, you know. There'd be fights in the schoolyard and things like that. So my father wanted to put me in the Catholic school in Braybrook, and I didn't realise how hard he tried until I had an interview with the principal at the Catholic school. And my father has always encouraged us to think for ourselves, because he wasn't allowed to think during Pol Pot years. And the principal said, look, the reason you've got in, even though there's a waiting list, is your father kept writing to us every month. And she pulled out all these letters, and these letters were typed in an old typewriter. And essentially most of the letters said, if you take my daughter, you can convert her to Catholicism by any way you want. And the principal said, I admire that, because a lot of students, their parents just baptise them as Catholic so that they can go to the Catholic school. But my father said, I won't do that to my daughter, but if you take her, you can make her into a good Catholic girl, and I'll be very pleased if you do, even though we're Buddhist. So I got into the Catholic school, and then my best friend in the Catholic school went to a private school in Essendon, and so my dad talked to her dad and decided to send me there. And then they heard about a school called Mac Robertson Girls High School, so I took an exam and got in year 11, and that was a very tough school. I only lasted 3 terms there, and then I went back to the private school, which is what led my mother to be a bit upset. She said, how does this jacket make you smarter, or things like that. But the private school was an interesting place, because at the valedictory dinner, as you mentioned before, which is the end of year dinner when awards are given, it was a very sad evening for me. It was because my parents, they were so excited, they got all dressed up, along with my friend Nian's parents and my friend Oslam's parents. These were all parents who were of migrant background, and they really wanted us to fit in. They wanted us to hang around the children of lawyers and doctors and accountants. And they saw us all sitting on the same table, this ethnic table, and they thought, what's happened here? We sent our kids to this special private school so they just assimilate, and they're hanging around each other. And the reason we hung around each other was that Oslam and Nian understood my family background, understood our houses were equally messy. We went home, Oslam's dad drove a taxi, Nian's parents sewed. We understood each other, and that was when realisation hit it really hard on these parents' faces. They thought, oh gosh, we may have spent a lot of money, but our kids are destined to be stuck with migrants forever. Yeah, it was a very strange evening. Oh, it was wonderful to write Laurinda. This is a difference between writing fiction and non-fiction. When your editor says to you, well, you might have to cut 10,000 words here. If it's non-fiction, if it's stories based on your life, you think, crap, I don't have that much life left to write. I'm 30 years old. Where am I going to get more source material? But when you're writing fiction and the editor says, cut 10,000 words, I think that's fine. I'll just make up another 10,000. So that was the biggest difference. It was the biggest liberty you have with fiction. I wrote not as a conscious decision. I didn't write because I wanted to get books published or, you know, I didn't know what all that meant. I wrote because, to be honest, if Facebook existed when I was growing up, I would have had a lot of comfort because I was at home and from a very young age, I was about 8 when I was looking after my sister Alison. She was born, and then came my sister Alina, and my brother's 3 years younger than me. So had all these children to look after at home, and I kept bugging my mum for a Cabbage Patch doll. And my mother would never buy me one because they cost $20 back then. They probably still do now. And $20 was a whole day's work for her. So she'd pick up my sister, the youngest one, and say, "You don't need a Cabbage Patch doll. Look, she's the same size." And I was so frustrated. If I had Facebook back then, Facebook really connects people. You could write, "Sister Alison peed twice in 2 hours. I'm so angry. I have to change her nappy." And you'd get 17 likes and you'd feel that you're not alone. But when you're in a concrete commission house by yourself at 9 years old with all these babies, you feel so lonely and you feel kind of angry at your parents because all the other kids firstly have Cabbage Patch dolls and secondly are probably visiting each other. And so I started writing diaries, very angry screeds. And as an adult, when I came to write my first book, I looked back over these diaries and I thought, hey, you know, I was angry back then, but they're pretty funny. One entry said, "I wish Mum and Dad would consult me first before making new babies." And so that's where my ideas came from, just from all these diaries I kept when I was younger. I mean, the 5 different schools I went to all had their good points and all had their bad points. None of them, of course, was as caricatured as this school, as you know, this school Laurinda. But the frightening thing is, I've had teachers come up to me and say, "Oh, that's like a school I worked at." I thought, that's horrible. Probably a school that teaches our child to be a good person. You know, the academic side isn't really that important. I got through 5 different school changes without much of a hassle, but the cultural changes were enormous. So you can learn your academics anyway. Your education can be, you know, change every year and you can still pick up, but if the culture is kind of bad, then yeah, everything collapses from there. Thank you. Thanks so much.